The Vikings' brutal execution methods were not whispered tales told by fearful peasants. They were lived realities, carved into the memory of an age where death walked beside every man. In the long shadow of their gods, where Odin demanded sacrifice and Thor thundered judgment, justice was not a thing of parchment and courts, but of axe, flame, and rope. To the Vikings, execution was more than punishment. It was spectacle, sacrifice, and warning, bound together in a ritual as old as the sagas themselves. When a man was condemned, the assembly of the Thing did not simply declare him guilty. It delivered him into the hands of the gods, and the manner of his death spoke louder than any words carved on stone. In this world, brutality was not cruelty for cruelty's sake. It was law given flesh. The Vikings understood that a quick death might cleanse honor, but a drawn-out torment proclaimed power. To see a traitor dangling from the gallows tree was to see Odin's justice mirrored on earth. To hear the hiss of flames devouring a condemned sorcerer was to watch hell claim what belonged to her. And when the blood eagle was carved into the back of a king, it was not only vengeance, but a gift to the Allfather, a death that tore the veil between Midgard and Asgard itself. Men and women alike gathered at these grim theatres, not out of mercy but out of necessity. To live in a land of wolves and endless seas meant that order could not be soft. The lash, the axe, the stone, the noose, all were tools to bind a people together under law and fear. Children watched alongside their elders, learning that the price of betrayal, cowardice, or dishonor was not hidden behind walls, but displayed in blood beneath the open sky. And yet, within this cruelty lay a strange respect. For the Viking who met death without a cry, who faced the flames or the blade with steady eyes, won a measure of honor even in ruin. Death was not an end, but a passage, and the way one died weighed heavily upon the scales of the afterlife. A coward's whimper might drag the soul to hell's frozen halls, but a warrior's silence might catch the eye of Odin himself. The Vikings' brutal execution methods were not accidents of savagery. They were designed, deliberate, shaped by law, faith, and fear. Each death was both punishment and performance, a tale told to the living through the destruction of flesh. To walk away from such a scene was to carry its lesson into one's bones, that in this world, mercy was rare, justice was sharp, and death always was watching. In the north, where the seas roared against black cliffs and winter winds cut to the bone, justice was not hidden in scrolls or sealed chambers. It was spoken aloud beneath the open sky, carried on the voices of free men gathered at the Thing. The Thing was no mere meeting. It was the heart of Viking law, a living court where disputes were weighed, blood feuds settled, and the fate of men declared. Here, honor was measured not by wealth alone, but by how one stood when the law's judgment fell. The Vikings believed that without order, a man's word was nothing, and without consequence, a man's deeds would tear the fabric of the clan apart. The Thing was both solemn and fierce. Chieftains, jarls, and freemen took their places in a circle, each man's presence a reminder that justice belonged to the people as much as to the rulers. Oaths were sworn upon the gods, and those who broke them faced punishments that echoed across the fjords. Some judgments ended in fines of silver or land, others in exile, stripping a man of kinship and casting him into the wild as though he no longer existed. But for the gravest crimes, murder without cause, betrayal of kin, sorcery, meant to corrupt the clan, the Thing did not banish. It condemned. When the sentence was passed, it carried the weight of the gods. Execution was not seen as cruelty, but as necessity, the binding of chaos by law. A man struck down at the Thing's command did not fall by the hand of one enemy, but by the will of the whole community. To hang from the gallows tree was to be a warning carved against the sky. To fall beneath the axe was to have the stain of treachery washed away in blood. Each punishment was more than death. It was a mirror held to the people, showing them the cost of breaking the order that kept them alive in a harsh and merciless world. Yet even in judgment there was room for honor. A man condemned could face his end with dignity, walking to the gallows with steady steps, or kneeling before the axe with clear eyes. To meet death without fear was to keep a shred of glory, for the sagas remembered those who stood tall, even as the thing decreed their doom. Women, too, were judged, their punishments often harsher, for their shame was thought to strike at the root of the family itself. Justice in the north was never soft, never hidden. It was lived beneath the open air, with the community as witness and the gods as overseers. The thing and the law were the bones that held Viking society upright, and execution was the blade that ensured those bones would not break. In the Viking world, justice was not just heard, it was seen, felt, and feared. The axe and the sword were not only weapons of war in the Viking world, they were also instruments of justice. When the thing decreed death, and when the condemned was a man of standing, a warrior, a noble, or one whose blood carried weight, the sentence was carried out not with torture or slow torment, but with steel. Beheading was the swiftest of Viking executions, and in its swiftness lay a strange honor. To die beneath the blade was to meet death face to face, unbroken, with no lingering humiliation. For a people who believed the manner of one's death shaped the fate of the soul, such an end was almost a mercy. The scene was stark. A man condemned would kneel before the community, his neck bared to the judgment of steel. Sometimes an axe, sometimes a sword, depending on the hands that carried out the act. The executioner was no masked stranger. Often it was a man chosen for his steadiness, his precision, his ability to make the stroke clean. A botched blow was a stain, both upon the executioner and upon the honor of the community, for the condemned deserved a death befitting his station. One stroke, clean through such was the expectation, though sagas whisper of those who suffered 2 or even 3 strikes before life left them. To behead was to grant a warrior's end. It separated him from the shame of lesser punishments, sparing him the gallows tree or the torment of fire. In the sagas, men who fell beneath the blade are often remembered with more dignity than those who lingered under slower deaths. The blood spilled at the axe's edge was seen as cleansing, a release of the soul, sending it to whatever judgment awaited in Valhalla or hell's cold halls. Those who died without flinching were praised, their final moments etched into memory as proof that courage did not falter even in defeat. But though it carried honor, beheading was still a spectacle. The gathered crowd would watch in silence, the weight of the law heavy upon them. The flash of steel, the thud of the severed head striking earth. These were reminders that justice was not a distant threat, but a presence as near as the sword on a warrior's belt. Children watched and learned. Women watched and judged. Men watched and remembered that even the proudest could kneel when the law demanded. The axe and the sword made execution both terrible and solemn. It was death without cruelty, yet still heavy with meaning. For the Vikings, justice was never soft, but neither was it always savage. To die swiftly by steel was to pay the price in blood, to bow once to the thing and forever after to the gods. In that single stroke, justice was done, and honor, though tarnished, could still cling to the fallen. The gallows tree rose stark against the northern sky, its branches bare, its purpose unmistakable. To the Vikings, hanging was more than a punishment, it was both shame and sacrifice, a death that carried the weight of earthly justice and the whisper of divine offering. When a man was condemned to the noose, he was not simply cast out of life, he was bound in the same manner that Odin himself had bound the hanged, dangling between the worlds, neither alive nor fully dead, until the rope claimed his last breath. Unlike the clean stroke of the axe, hanging was marked with dishonor. It was not given to nobles or warriors who had fought bravely, but to those whose crimes struck at the heart of the law: thieves, oath-breakers, cowards, and sorcerers. To hang from the gallows tree was to be displayed before gods and men alike as an offering of bloodless sacrifice. The condemned swayed in the wind, body broken not by blade, but by the tightening rope, his death slow, his dignity stripped away. Such an end was humiliation, yet it was also a mirror of Odin's own sacrifice, when the Allfather hung upon Yggdrasil for 9 nights to seize the wisdom of the runes. This link to the god of death and knowledge gave hanging a fearful power. Some believed that those who died on the gallows were taken directly into Odin's grasp, not as honoured guests of Valhalla, but as offerings that fed his eternal hunger for souls. Others whispered that Hel stretched her hand instead, pulling the swaying dead into her shadowed hall. For the living who watched, it mattered little where the soul went. The body left twisting from the tree spoke loudly enough. The gallows were always raised in places where all could see, on hillsides above the fjords, at crossroads, or near the Thing. The site was not meant for mercy. It was a warning carved into the land itself. Travellers passing beneath would see the hanging body, birds pecking at the eyes, and know the fate of those who defied the law. For families of the condemned, the shame lingered far longer than the corpse, for hanging marked not just the man, but his kin. And yet, even in its cruelty, there was a strange reverence. The act of hanging carried echoes of ritual sacrifice, a gift to the unseen powers that governed fate. To die by rope was to be given up to forces greater than men. In this, the Vikings revealed their belief that justice was never only human. It was bound to the gods, to the threads of destiny that no man could cut. Hanging from the gallows tree was therefore both punishment and offering, humiliation and sacrifice. It was the grim reminder that the law watched all, and that Odin's shadow stretched over every life. The tree stood tall, its branches heavy with silence, declaring that, in the north, justice and death were never far apart. The fjords, with their black waters and sheer cliffs, were both lifeline and grave to the Vikings. It was from these waters that men drew fish to feed their families and set sail to plunder distant shores. But it was also into these same depths that the condemned were cast when the Thing decreed drowning as their fate. To be bound and sunk beneath the cold surface was to be swallowed by the very element that sustained life in the north, a judgment as merciless as the sea itself. Unlike the swift stroke of an axe, drowning offered no clean passage. It was slow, inevitable, and shrouded in shame. Most often, it was women who faced this watery death. Sorcery, betrayal, and adultery were crimes thought to corrupt the hearth and the bloodline, and thus demanded punishments that carried both disgrace and finality. A woman accused of weaving spells in secret, of betraying her husband's trust, or of breaking sacred bonds, could find herself led to the water's edge, bound in rope or weighed with stones. The community gathered to watch, for such executions were not done in shadows. The crowd's silence was broken only by the gulls overhead and the rush of the tide, as the condemned was thrust into the waves. The fjords made no sound of pity. The sea took its victims without hesitation, pulling them down into its dark belly, where light vanished and breath fled. To those watching from the shore, the struggle was brief, a flailing of limbs, a final, desperate gasp, then stillness. Yet beneath the surface, the fight was far longer, crueler, as lungs filled with salt water and the body yielded to the crushing cold. The Vikings knew this, and that knowledge was part of the punishment. Drowning was not only the end of life, it was a trial of terror, a stripping of hope. Tales tell of women tied in sacks with serpents or cats, cursed to die with biting creatures at their sides, a practice meant to mark them as more than criminals, as outcasts beyond human pity. To be drowned was to be erased, denied even the pyre that might have carried the soul upward in smoke. Instead, the sea claimed them, their spirits left to wander the deeps, restless and forgotten. Some whispered that the drowned might serve Ran, the sea goddess who gathered souls into her net, never to reach Valhalla or hell. For the living, the sight of drowning was a lesson etched in the waves. The fjords that fed their households could just as easily consume those who broke the sacred bonds of trust. It was justice and warning combined, as natural and brutal as the tide itself. In the Viking world, the waters gave and the waters took away, and when the law demanded it, the sea became executioner. The longhouse was the heart of Viking life warmth in winter, the place where feasts were held and sagas sung. Yet under the hand of justice, that same hall of fellowship could become a tomb of fire. To be burned alive in the longhouse was among the most terrible of Viking punishments, reserved for those whose crimes were thought to poison the very fabric of kinship, treachery, betrayal, or deeds that struck against the hearth itself. Where others might face the sword or the noose, these were given to the flames, and the house that once sheltered them became their pyre. The condemned was led inside, bound and helpless, the walls around him thick with timber, the roof heavy with dried thatch. No quick blade awaited here. Instead, the doors were barred, the exits sealed, and kindling heaped along the walls. Outside, the gathered community stood in silence as torches touched the wood. At first came only smoke, curling through the gaps, a low crackle as fire licked along the beams. Then the hall roared alive, its timbers hissing, the flames devouring faster than a man could draw breath. Within, the air grew unlivable. The condemned choked before the fire itself reached him, eyes stung blind, lungs filling with smoke, until every gasp was agony. If he cried out, his voice was drowned in the thunder of burning wood. When at last the flames closed in, flesh blistered, hair caught, and the body became fuel like the timbers themselves. It was not only death, but erasure, nothing left but ash scattered among the ruins. This punishment carried a meaning deeper than mere execution. The longhouse was sacred, its hearth the soul of the clan. To burn a man within it was to declare that he had defiled kinship itself, that his blood had stained the bonds which tied family and community together. The fire did not only consume his body, it cleansed the dishonor he had brought, purifying by destruction. To the Vikings, fire was a power of the gods, feared and revered, both a gift of warmth and a destroyer that spared nothing. In giving the criminal to the flames, they gave him over to forces greater than themselves. There are tales of whole households condemned in this way, traitors locked inside their own hall, their legacy consumed along with their lives, leaving only blackened stones where once laughter and feasts had echoed. Such executions sent shudders through the land, for no man could look upon the charred ruins of a hall without remembering that kinship, once broken, was punished with fire. Burned alive in the longhouse, the condemned was denied the dignity of the axe, denied even the sea's cold embrace. He was made an offering to flame, his life extinguished in the very place where life should have been strongest. For the Vikings, it was justice made fire, and fire made final. The pit yawned dark and silent, its depth hidden beneath a shifting coil of scales. Few punishments in Viking lore struck greater terror into the heart than the pit of serpents. It was no common execution, no mere stroke of steel or choking rope, but a death that belonged to legend, spoken of in hushed tones around the fire. To be cast among snakes was not simply to die, it was to be condemned as worse than an enemy, as a traitor or oath-breaker whose blood had soured beyond redemption. The sagas tell of this fate most clearly in the story of King Ella of Northumbria. Captured by the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, when the blood eagle was not chosen, it was said that he was thrown into a pit of serpents, their fangs sinking into his flesh, venom searing through his veins until his body stiffened and his cries faded to silence. Whether truth or tale, the punishment carried meaning that echoed louder than any axe. For in the Norse mind, snakes were not creatures of earth alone. but threads of chaos tied to Jormungandr, the world serpent destined to rise at Ragnarok. To be given to them was to be devoured by the very forces of disorder a man had unleashed by breaking faith. The condemned, bound in rope or chains, would be dragged to the edge of the pit while the crowd watched from above. Some sagas describe the moment of hurling, the body plunging down into the writhing mass, swallowed not by water or flame, but by living death. There was no honour here, no chance to show courage in a single blow. This was terror unrelenting, the hiss of scales, the strike of fangs, the slow burn of poison creeping through the blood. For oath-breakers, it was a fitting end, a long, choking punishment for those who had poisoned the trust of kin and clan. The pit itself was more than a prison, it was a symbol. To the Vikings, betrayal did not simply wound men, it threatened the very order that bound their world together. And so the punishment reflected the crime. Just as a serpent strikes unseen, the traitor had struck his kin from shadows. And just as venom spreads to weaken and kill, so did betrayal spread rot through families and halls. The pit of serpents repaid such poison with poison, binding crime and punishment in a grim symmetry. Whether these pits truly existed or were born from saga and fear, their power is undiminished. They remind us that for the Vikings, justice was not always swift or merciful. It was often crafted to mirror the crime itself, turning the punishment into a tale retold for generations. And in those tales, the serpent's hiss has never stilled, nor the pit fully closed. Among all the terrors whispered in the sagas, none strikes deeper into the marrow than the blood eagle. To hear its name was to feel the weight of both vengeance and sacrifice. For this was no common execution of rope or axe, but a ritual carved into flesh that blurred the line between punishment and offering to the gods. The blood eagle was spoken of in low voices, its cruelty so vast that even those who praised it questioned if it truly belonged to men or to the gods themselves. The act began with the condemned laid face down, their arms stretched wide as if already pinned by unseen wings. Then the knife was drawn, cutting deep into the back, peeling open the flesh to reveal bone and sinew. With grim precision, the ribs were severed from the spine one by one, cracked outward like the bars of a cage. Through this gaping wound, the lungs were pulled forth and laid across the spread ribs, fluttering like wings in the last desperate breaths of life. Thus, the eagle was made, not in flight across the skies, but in blood upon the body of a man. This execution was not given to thieves or cowards, but to kings, earls, and enemies whose deaths demanded more than the ordinary. The sagas tell us that when King Ella of Northumbria slew Ragnar Lothbrok, Ragnar's sons avenged him by carving the blood eagle upon their father's killer. Others speak of Halfdan Longlegs meeting the same fate. Whether these tales are truth or tale, they reveal what mattered most, that the blood eagle was remembered not only as death, but as message. It declared that vengeance had been paid in full, and that the gods themselves had received the sacrifice. For Odin, the eagle was sacred, a creature of war and wisdom. To carve an eagle into a man's back was to dedicate him to the All-Father, to send him bleeding and broken as an offering across the bridge between Midgard and Asgard. Yet, there was more than faith in this ritual, there was fear. The victim was expected to endure without a cry, to hold silence while his ribs cracked and his lungs heaved. To die with such strength was to prove worth even in ruin. To scream was to show weakness unfit for the warrior's path. Scholars still argue whether the blood eagle was ever truly wrought in full, or whether the sagas shaped a symbol into a supposed deed. But to the people of that age, belief alone gave it power. The thought of ribs splitting, of lungs rising and falling outside the body, was terror enough to stain the mind and steal the law. Whether myth or memory, the blood eagle stands as the most infamous of Viking executions, a death that was also a sacrifice, a punishment that became legend, and a ritual that bound vengeance, faith, and fear in the shape of an eagle's wings. There were deaths in the north that came not from the hand of one, but from the many. Among these was stoning, a punishment that belonged not to the axe, the rope, or the fire, but to the gathered strength of the tribe itself. When a man or woman was sentenced to be stoned, it meant the crime was not only against one, but against all. In this way, the entire community became executioner. Each stone cast a piece of justice hurled from the hand of neighbour, kin, or rival. The condemned was led to a place chosen for the deed, often a barren clearing or a field at the edge of the settlement, where the earth itself seemed stripped of warmth. There was no scaffold, no raised platform. Instead, the criminal was set in the open, exposed before the circle of faces that had once been his people. Then, stones were placed in waiting hands. They were not great boulders, but sharp, heavy rocks, chosen to wound, to break, to bleed by 100 strikes rather than one. At the signal, the storm began. The first stones struck with thuds and cracks, some glancing, some cutting, all carrying the weight of judgment. The condemned cried out or stood silent, staggering beneath the rain of blows, the skin splitting, bones snapping beneath the relentless hail. The punishment was not swift. Stoning was meant to prolong, to draw every heartbeat through pain and fear until the body could endure no more. The crowd's fury became its rhythm, each hand casting its stone, each voice joining in the roar that swelled as the condemned faltered and fell. In this lay its power. Stoning erased the line between punisher and witness. No single man bore the burden of killing, all shared it. No family could claim vengeance against an executioner, for the hand that struck was everyone's. The tribe itself had declared the criminal unworthy of belonging, and so the tribe itself cast them out with stones, body broken in sight of all. To be stoned was not only to die, it was to be denied any bond of kin or clan, to be slain as though one were already less than human. The sagas speak rarely of stoning, yet its shadow lingers. It was reserved for crimes that poisoned the heart of the community, betrayal, witchcraft, the breaking of oaths that bound men together. In these moments, a single death by steel was not enough. The people themselves demanded a share in the punishment, so that none could doubt the will of the law or the wrath of the gods who watched from above. When the last stone had fallen and the body lay broken in the dust, the crowd dispersed, leaving behind only silence and the bloodied earth. Stoning was a grim reminder that justice in the Viking world was not always carried out by kings or chieftains. It could rise from the hands of the people themselves, as unyielding and merciless as the stones they hurled. There are deaths that come swiftly, with the flash of steel or the tightening of rope. And then there are deaths that grind the life out of a man inch by inch, where every breath grows heavier, every heartbeat slower, until the body yields beneath a weight too great to bear. Among the most dreadful of these was the punishment of being crushed beneath stones, a slow destruction designed to stretch agony into hours, even days, and to leave the living with a vision they would not forget. The condemned was taken to a place of judgment, often a bare patch of earth where all could gather to witness. He was laid flat upon the ground, arms and legs spread, his chest rising and falling with the knowledge that each breath might be his last. At first, a single stone was placed upon him, heavy enough to press but not to kill. Then came another, and another, each added with grim deliberation. The weight built slowly, crushing ribs, pinning limbs, forcing the lungs to labour for air. There was no sudden release, only the creeping certainty that the body was being broken not by blade, but by the earth's own burden. The cries of the condemned were part of the ritual, rising with each stone, until the voice grew hoarse, then faint, then fell silent beneath the grinding weight. Those who watched did so not with laughter, but with a solemn dread, for crushing was no ordinary punishment. It was reserved for crimes that tore at the roots of law and kinship treachery, oath-breaking, or deeds that demanded the whole community see justice drawn out before their eyes. The slowness was the point. Unlike the axe or sword, which cut life away in an instant, crushing forced a man to feel his own undoing. The chest collapsed inch by inch, the heart straining until it faltered, the breath rattling shorter and shorter as the stones pressed deeper. Some men cursed their fate until their voices broke, others lay silent, staring skyward as though already beyond the reach of pain. A few, it is told, showed defiance to the end, meeting the gaze of the crowd even as their bodies twisted beneath the growing mound. And when at last the condemned was still, when ribs had snapped and blood had filled the lungs, the pile of stones was left standing over him like a cairn, not only a grave but a warning. Travellers passing would see the heap and know what crime had been punished there, the weight of justice made visible in rock and earth. To be crushed beneath stones was more than death. It was the stripping away of dignity, the slow unmaking of flesh and spirit beneath a burden that no man could resist. It was the law given weight, the wrath of the people made solid. And as long as the cairn remained, so too did the memory of the one who had been ground into silence beneath it. In the deep forests of the north, where pines rose like spears and oaks groaned in the wind, the very trees themselves were sometimes turned into executioners. Among the most fearsome punishments remembered in sagas and whispers was the fate of being tied between trees. It was a death that belonged not to steel or fire, but to the raw strength of nature itself, savage, unrelenting, and without pity. The condemned was dragged into the woods, where two great saplings had been chosen, their young trunks supple, their branches straining skyward. Men laboured to bend them down, forcing them low to the earth, ropes creaking as the green wood fought against its restraint. The victim, bound hand and foot, was fastened to these living engines of destruction, one arm and one leg to each tree, stretched across the space between. The forest grew silent, as though even the birds held their breath, waiting for the moment of release. Then, with a signal, the ropes were cut. The trees sprang upward with the fury of the earth itself, their stored strength unleashed in an instant. The body caught between them was torn apart, limbs wrenched from their sockets, flesh split, bone shattered. It was not death in silence, but in a scream that split the air, cut short as the body gave way to forces no man could withstand. What remained was no warrior's corpse, but pieces scattered upon the soil, a warning written in blood at the roots of the trees. This method was not for every crime. It was saved for those whose treachery was so deep, whose betrayal so poisonous, that the community demanded more than mere killing. Oath-breakers, murderers of kin, or enemies whose deaths were meant to terrify others, these were given to the trees. In this lay the meaning. Just as they had torn apart the bonds of kinship and trust, so were they themselves torn apart, their bodies ripped asunder in a grim mirror of the crime they had wrought. The crowd who witnessed such a death did not soon forget it. To see a man destroyed by the snapping force of the trees was to see nature itself take vengeance, the earth punishing what men could not forgive. The trees stood afterward as silent sentinels, their branches swaying as though still restless with the memory of the violence they had unleashed. Some said such places remained cursed, the ground forever stained, the trees whispering of the death they had dealt. To be tied between trees was not merely to be killed, it was to be unmade. It was a punishment that showed the strength of the law, the wrath of the people, and the raw fury of the land itself. In the Viking world, where man and nature were bound together by fate, there could be no more fitting execution than to let the forest itself tear the condemned to pieces. The sea was the Vikings' path to wealth and glory, but it could also become their judge, jury, and executioner. When the thing declared a man unworthy of axe or rope, when exile was not enough to erase his stain, he was given instead to the waves. Execution at sea was a fate both dreaded and pitied, for to be cast adrift was neither swift nor merciful. It was a slow abandonment to hunger, thirst, and the merciless embrace of the ocean, a death that came not by a man's hand, but by the will of the gods who ruled the waters. The condemned was placed into a small boat, stripped of oars, stripped of sails, stripped of all hope of steering. Sometimes food and drink were withheld, leaving him to waste away in the silence of the waves. Sometimes a single jug of water or a crust of bread was left at his side, a cruel token that only stretched his suffering. With ropes cut and no anchor to hold him, the boat drifted from the shore, carried by tide and wind into the endless blue, while those on land stood watching until the speck was swallowed by distance. The sea was not a gentle captor. Days beneath the burning sun brought thirst that clawed at the throat. Nights brought cold winds that cut through the skin, and always there was the endless heaving of the water. Some victims starved, their bodies wasting as gulls circled above. Others found their frail crafts broken by storms, their last moments spent clinging to shattered wood before the depths pulled them under. And if fortune proved crueler still, the condemned lived long enough to feel madness creep in, speaking to waves as though they were kin, hearing voices in the shriek of seabirds and the groan of timbers. To the Vikings, such a fate carried meaning beyond cruelty. The sea was sacred, bound to the goddess Ran, who cast her net to snare drowning souls, and to Aegir, whose wrath could smash the mightiest longships. To be abandoned to the waves was to be delivered directly into their keeping, a sacrifice as much as a punishment. Some believed the souls of the adrift wandered forever, neither in Valhalla nor hell, but lost between worlds, carried on the tide, until the end of days. The stories of those cast adrift lived on, carried from village to village as warnings. No man who watched the slow vanishing of a boat could fail to understand the lesson. The community had cast him away. The gods would decide the rest. In a world where the sea was both lifeblood and terror, no punishment struck deeper than to be given to it, helpless and alone. To be cast adrift was to vanish into silence, to become one with the waves, nameless and forgotten, claimed by the same waters that had once carried him to life. There are deaths that come with fire, others with steel, but few carry the cold terror of being swallowed by the earth itself. Among the most merciless punishments remembered in the north was the fate of being buried alive, either beneath the weight of soil or entombed within the suffocating grip of snow. It was a sentence not only of death, but of erasure, sealing the condemned away from kin, from the gaze of gods, from the memory of men. Where the axe might end a life in a single stroke, burial alive stretched death into silence, making the earth itself the executioner. The condemned was led to a pit carved in the frozen ground, or to a drift where snow lay deep and heavy. Bound and helpless, they were lowered into the hollow as the gathered crowd stood in grim witness. There was no fire, no roar of the sea, no cry of birds overhead, only the scrape of shovels or the thud of packed snow as the living sealed their victim's tomb. The earth fell slowly at first, striking the body, dusting the face. Then came more, heavier, until only the condemned's head was left above the surface. Sometimes it was left uncovered, so that the final gasps could be seen and heard as the body stiffened in the cold. Other times, the last shovelful fell upon the mouth and nose, plunging the victim into darkness. The struggle was long, marked by muffled cries beneath the soil, by desperate shifting as the chest laboured against the weight pressing down. When snow was the weapon, it crept into the lungs, freezing breath itself, numbing flesh until the condemned no longer knew where body ended and ice began. Death came not at once, but as a slow surrender, first of voice, then of strength, and finally of the spirit itself. Such punishment was reserved for the most hated offences, those that threatened not just a man's honour, but the safety of all. Witchcraft, treachery, the betrayal of kin, these crimes called for an end beyond blood. To be buried alive was to be denied both the cleansing of fire and the freedom of the sea. It was to be locked into the earth as if already dead, without rights, without remembrance, without hope of the afterlife. The soul, it was said, lingered trapped with the body, wandering in silence beneath the soil, neither in Valhalla nor in hell, but lost forever. For the people who watched, the lesson was heavy. The earth that gave grain and the snow that guarded their homes through winter could also become a tomb. To see a man buried alive was to see him vanish, swallowed by the very land that sustained life. And when the crowd dispersed, leaving only a mound of earth or a frozen drift, the warning remained. In the north, justice could be as cold and merciless as the land itself. There were punishments in the north that struck not only at the body, but at the very soul, casting a man beyond the bounds of kinship and law. Among these was the wolf pit, a place dug deep into the earth, dark and stinking, where wild beasts waited with slavering jaws. To be thrown into such a pit was to be declared no longer human, no longer worthy of fire, steel, or even the gallows. It was to be given over to the wilderness itself, to die as prey rather than as man. The wolf pit was a crude but terrible thing. A hole lined with sharpened stakes, baited with carrion, and often holding the half-starved wolves that hunters had trapped. The condemned, bound hand and foot, was dragged before the edge as the beasts below howled and snapped, their eyes shining with hunger. There was no dignity in such a death. No final words to the crowd, no chance for silent courage. The victim was cast down like refuse, hurled into darkness where the law of men no longer held sway. The fall alone could break bones, leaving the condemned writhing helpless upon the dirt. Then came the wolves, gaunt shapes circling, their growls reverberating in the pit like drums of doom. The first bite tore flesh, the second ripped deeper, and soon the cries of the victim mingled with the snarls of beasts tasting blood. The crowd above heard every sound, yet none moved to help. For this was the purpose of the wolf pit, to strip the condemned of any last shred of belonging. If the axe had given him a warrior's end, if the rope had given him the gallows shame, the wolf pit gave him only the death of an outcast, a thing unfit for human memory. In the sagas, such punishment was spoken of rarely, for it was reserved for the most grievous offenders, oath-breakers who betrayed their kin, murderers who defiled hearth and hall, or thralls who rose against their masters. By casting them into the pit, the community proclaimed that they had become less than men, worthy only of the beasts they had descended to in spirit. It was said that the soul of one devoured in such a way would never find its path to Valhalla or hell, but wander eternally, denied both man's world and the gods. For those who watched from above, the wolf pit was more than execution. It was a reminder that the line between man and beast was thin, and that honor alone kept a warrior from falling into savagery. The pit devoured not just flesh but legacy, for who could sing of a man torn by wolves? When the cries ceased and silence returned, the pit was covered over, leaving no grave, no marker, only the memory of a death too shameful to be remembered. In this way, the wolf pit declared its final judgment. Some men did not deserve to die among men at all. When men could not agree, and when words alone could not pierce the tangle of accusation and denial, the Vikings turned to the gods. Trial by ordeal was not mere justice of men, but judgment laid bare before higher powers. In such moments, the condemned stood not only against his accusers, but against fate itself, for the outcome was believed to reveal the will of Odin, Thor, or Freya. If innocence lived within him, the gods would grant him strength. If guilt stained his soul, no mortal courage could save him. The ordeals took many shapes, each as cruel as the next. One might be forced to grasp a rod of iron heated until it glowed red, to carry it across the ground for paces counted aloud before all. The burns were bound, and after days the wounds were uncovered. If they had begun to heal cleanly, the gods had shown favour. If they festered and blackened, guilt was plain, and punishment followed swiftly. Others faced the boiling cauldron, plunging their hand into scalding water to seize a stone from the depths. The crowd held its breath as flesh blistered and tore, waiting to see if healing or corruption would tell the truth. More brutal still was the duel of Holmgang, where two men met with steel upon an island or marked ground, fighting until blood was spilled or one lay broken in the dirt. In such trials, victory itself was proof of righteousness, for it was believed the gods lent their strength to the innocent. Yet these battles were not always fair contests of might. The accused, weakened by chains or hunger, often faced men chosen to ensure his doom, the gods invoked, but men's hands deciding the blow. The ordeal was not only about guilt or innocence, it was a theatre of belief. To endure pain without flinching was to show the strength of spirit. To cry out or falter was to reveal corruption within. Men and women alike submitted, their fates tied to the heat of iron or the edge of a blade, and the watching crowd felt that in those moments the gods themselves were present. Every blister, every drop of blood was a sign read as one might read the runes. When the ordeal revealed guilt, execution was swift. The condemned might hang from the gallows, lose his head to the axe, or be cast into the sea. Yet even in death, the ordeal gave weight to the judgment, for none could claim the sentence was unjust. The gods had spoken, and their word was final. Trial by ordeal was thus both punishment and prayer, a bridge between men and the unseen. It was harsh, merciless, and often fatal, but it gave the people certainty in a world where truth was hard to find. In the end, the gods decided, and men obeyed. Few deaths in the north carried as much fear and loathing as those dealt to witches and sorcerers. To the Vikings, magic was a force that cut both ways save it could heal, guide, and foretell, yet it could also corrupt, curse, and tear apart the bonds of kinship. Men might wield weapons and strength, but a woman or man who bent unseen powers against the clan was thought to wound deeper than any blade. For such crimes, ordinary punishments would not suffice. Execution for witchcraft and sorcery demanded a death as terrible as the guilt, a spectacle that erased both body and spirit. Accusations of dark magic often began in whispers. A harvest failed, a child sickened, a ship sank in calm seas. Fingers turned toward the one who spoke to spirits, who cast runes, who muttered charms when no one watched. Once suspicion grew, the thing might condemn the accused not simply for crime, but for the danger their very presence brought upon the living. To let such a one walk free was to invite disaster, for the gods themselves despised those who twisted fate for their own ends. The punishments were varied, each chosen to break not only the flesh but the sorcery itself. Some witches were dragged to the shore, bound and hurled into the sea, for water was thought to cleanse corruption. If they drowned, their curse died with them. If they floated, it was taken as proof of their guilt, and harsher death awaited. Others were buried alive in earth or snow, sealed away so that their whispers would never again reach the ears of men or gods. Fire, too, was a favoured sentence. The condemned locked in a house or tied to a stake, their bodies consumed so that no trace remained for dark spirits to cling to. The most feared fate was to be stoned or beaten by the community, for in this way every hand helped destroy the witch. Such a death was more than vengeance. It was purification, the people casting out corruption together so that it could not return. The accused had no place among men, no grave to be tended, no cairn to mark their resting. Their ashes were scattered, their bones hidden, their names cursed and forgotten. Yet even in these moments, fear lingered. It was said that witches died hard, cursing those who struck them, calling down storms or sickness with their final breath. Executioners feared to meet their gaze, and some covered the witches' eyes before death, lest their souls slip out to wound the living. To be executed for witchcraft and sorcery was to be cut from all ties, denied honour, denied remembrance. The punishment was harsh, the death often terrible, but in the eyes of the Vikings, it was necessity. Better one life destroyed utterly than a whole clan ruined by whispers in the dark. For in a world where the gods watched closely, there was no crime more dangerous than trying to steal their power. In the north, a man's worth was measured not by the wealth he held, nor by the years he lived, but by how he faced the clash of steel. Battle was the forge of honour, and to stand firm beneath shield and spear was to prove oneself worthy of kin and gods alike. Yet there was no crime so despised as cowardice. To turn one's back in battle, to flee while brothers fought and bled, was to tear at the very soul of the clan. For such shame, the axe or rope might have seemed mercy. Execution for cowardice was worse, for it stripped a man not only of life but of honour, branding him with disgrace that lingered even after his body was gone. The coward was no common criminal. Thieves could be punished, sorcerers burned, oath-breakers cast adrift, yet even these crimes did not wound the clan as deeply as the sight of a warrior casting down his arms. In the sagas, such men were remembered not with pity, but with venom. To allow one coward to live was to invite more, and so the thing judged harshly. Death was not avoided, but made certain, and it was dealt with contempt. Some were beheaded, their bodies left unburied, as a sign that no cairn should mark their shame. Others were hanged, not as sacrifice to Odin, but as mockery, their swaying forms reminders of broken courage. In harsher tales, the coward was stoned by the very men he had abandoned. His death, a storm of fury, cast from hands, once meant to shield him. Worst of all was when the coward was cast from the community altogether, hunted like a beast, slain where he was found, and denied even the rights of fire or earth. His soul was thought unworthy of the afterlife, destined to wander nameless, barred from Valhalla where true warriors feasted. Cowardice was feared more than wounds, for a wound brought honour, proof that a man had stood his ground. A scar was a tale to be told by firelight, a badge that lifted his name in song. But to flee, to leave brothers to bleed alone, was to kill one's honour before death claimed the flesh. Even kin would turn their backs upon such men, for his shame stained the family as surely as blood stains a blade. Execution for cowardice was not only punishment, but warning. To fight to the last breath, even in hopeless battle, was better than to live one moment as a coward. The sagas tell of warriors who welcomed death rather than risk dishonour, laughing as they fell, knowing their courage would carry them to Odin's hall. Thus the coward's fate was sealed by his own choice, for in fleeing he chose a death more bitter than any sword could bring. In the north, it was better to die with steel in hand than to live long enough to meet such an end. The life of a thrall in the Viking world was already heavy with chains, but when a slave was condemned, his death was made harsher still. Unlike freemen, who might be granted the dignity of the axe, thralls were shown no such mercy. They were property, and when their masters judged them guilty of theft, betrayal, or defiance, their end was shaped to remind all who watched that a slave's life carried no honour. Slave executions were not only about punishment, they were performances of humiliation, stripping the condemned of humanity before delivering them to death. Some thralls were hanged, not upon gallows raised with solemnity, but from crooked branches or barn beams, their bodies left swinging as though they were refuse. Others were drowned like vermin, bound and cast into wells or fjords, their deaths unmarked and their names unspoken. In certain tales, thralls were stoned by their own fellows at their master's command, a cruel ritual that forced the lowest to destroy one of their own, teaching submission through fear. The act was less about justice than it was about reminding every slave of their place, silent, obedient, disposable. Burning was another fate dealt to thralls, though not with the ritual of witchcraft or the fire's symbolism of purification. For slaves, fire was simply destruction, thrown into huts set alight or tied among kindling. Their screams were drowned by crackling flame, their bodies consumed until no trace remained. Unlike nobles or warriors who might be sung about even in death, thralls left no song, no saga, only ashes scattered to the wind. The most degrading deaths came through mockery. Some masters forced thralls to fight beasts or each other, promising freedom to the survivor, but delivering only death once the spectacle was done. Others were mutilated before execution, hands or ears cut away so that their deaths would be remembered as shameful displays rather than solemn judgments. Even burial was denied to many, their corpses left for dogs or birds, for a thrall's body was thought unworthy of cairn or pyre. Yet beneath the cruelty lay fear. Thralls outnumbered freemen in many places, and their quiet rebellion was always a shadow on the walls of the longhouse. The harshness of their executions was not only to punish the guilty, but to warn the living. Each slave who watched saw his own fate mirrored in the broken body of the condemned. The message was clear: obedience was life, defiance was torment. In the Viking world, where freedom was bound to honour, the thrall's death was made to show he had neither. He died not as a man, but as a reminder, his passing marked not by mourning but by silence. Slave executions revealed the brutal edge of Norse justice, where law bent to power and mercy was given only to those whose blood was free. For the thrall, even death itself was owned by another's will. In the Viking world, death by judgment was never hidden. Executions were not whispered away in the dark, but carried out beneath the sky where all could see. They were public, deliberate, and carefully staged, for the death of one was meant to shape the lives of many. The thing did not only decree punishment, it commanded a spectacle, a theatre of death where justice was carved into flesh before the eyes of the people. In this way, law was not merely spoken, it was made visible, seared into memory with the sound of bone breaking, the sight of flames consuming, the cries of the condemned echoing across the crowd. Men, women, and children gathered when the sentence was to be carried out. Some came from duty, others from curiosity, many from fear, but all came. The crowd itself was part of the ritual, its presence binding the judgment with the weight of community. To look away was to refuse the law's lesson, and so every eye followed the act, whether in silence, in muttered prayers, or in shouted curses. Each punishment, whether hanging, drowning, or the blood eagle, became a story retold, not in hushed shame, but in open warning. The people left the scene with the image burned into their minds, carrying it to their homes, their children, their neighbours. For the condemned, the presence of the crowd was its own torment. A man might face the axe alone, but to face it under the eyes of all was to be stripped bare, his honour dissected before his kin. If he met death with silence, the crowd might murmur respect. If he screamed, if he begged, his shame lived longer than his body. Women condemned for sorcery or betrayal endured more than pain. They endured the judgment of every face that stared upon them, knowing their names would be cursed in stories long after the flames or waves had claimed them. For the rulers and chieftains, public death was power. Each execution reminded the people that law was not a thing of distant words, but of living blood. When a traitor's head fell, the crowd knew it was the hand of the chieftain, the will of the gods, and the strength of the community bound together. No one left such a gathering untouched. Fear and awe mingled in their hearts, and with them came obedience. The theatre of death served more than vengeance. It held the community together. By standing as one, by witnessing, they shared in the justice and carried its weight home with them. The spectacle turned law into memory, into legend, into warning. Thus, in the Viking Age, execution was not only the end of a man's life. It was a performance in which gods, rulers, and people all took part, a grim play written in blood to ensure that order endured. In the north, no execution was carried out without the shadow of the gods looming close. The Vikings did not see punishment as the work of men alone. Every death decreed by the thing was bound to higher powers, to Odin, who hung upon the tree, to Thor, who punished oath-breakers with his hammer, and to Hel, who waited cold and patient for the unworthy. Justice was not only law, it was sacrifice, a binding of human deeds to the will of the divine. To strike down a criminal was to remind the people that the gods themselves demanded balance, and that every crime echoed not only against kin and clan, but against the fabric of the cosmos. When a man swung from the gallows tree, his death was seen as more than punishment. Hanging belonged to Odin, who himself endured 9 nights upon Yggdrasil to seize the runes of wisdom. Thus, each hanged body became an offering, a soul given over to the Allfather, as if the condemned were unwilling sacrifices, feeding his hunger for knowledge and death. Warriors whispered that Odin walked among the swaying corpses, claiming them for his unseen host, even if their crimes barred them from Valhalla's feasting hall. Fire, too, belonged to the gods. Thor, whose thunder split the heavens, was called upon when flames consumed the guilty. To burn was to purify, to strip the body of corruption and offer smoke to the skies, carrying the condemned as ash to the realm beyond. Yet for those accused of witchcraft, fire did more than cleanse, it destroyed utterly, denying hell even the bones, ensuring that no trace of the sorcerer's corruption lingered in the world of men. The fire's roar was a hymn, a reminder that the gods demanded purity, even through destruction. And always there was Hel, daughter of Loki, who claimed those who died, dishonored, sick, or shamed. Many executions were carried out with her in mind, for the people believed that traitors, oath-breakers, and cowards were already hers. The axe might fall, the sea might take, the earth might swallow, but it was Hel's cold hand that guided such souls into her misty hall. To be executed in shame was to be cast from the chants of Valhalla, to be turned away from Odin's company of the brave, and to walk forever in the grey silence of Helheim. Thus, every execution was doubled in meaning. It punished the flesh, but also fed the gods. Each swing of the axe, each tightening of rope, each rising flame was both justice and offering, binding the mortal world to the divine. To live in the Viking age was to know that law and faith were never apart, that to break the law was to insult the gods, and to die by execution was to repay the debt not only to men, but to the unseen powers that ruled over fate itself. In the Viking world, women carried power, both feared and revered. They kept the hearth, bound families together, and often guided the unseen forces of fate. But when a woman was judged guilty of betrayal, sorcery, or dishonor, her punishment was marked with a cruelty shaped not only by law, but by the weight of shame. Executions for women were rarely swift. They were designed to strip her of dignity, to silence her voice, and to cast her beyond the bonds of kinship. To see a woman condemned was to see a warning that even those who held the hearth could be broken if they defied law and order. Drowning was a fate most often dealt to women. Bound in rope, sometimes weighted with stones, the condemned was led to the fjord or river and cast into the water before the eyes of the people. The sea, which gave life to the north, took her as judgment. Many believed the water cleansed corruption, swallowing the accused, so no trace of her curse or betrayal remained. The sight of a woman's figure thrashing against the pull of the deep struck terror into all who watched, for it was not only her life that ended, but her memory washed away by the tide. Others met fire. Burning was thought to purify, yet for women accused of witchcraft or adultery, the flames became torment rather than cleansing. They were tied to a stake or shut inside a house with wood piled high, and the blaze consumed them as the crowd bore witness. The crackle of fire and the rising smoke were seen as offerings to the gods, carrying away the corruption of the accused. Yet those who watched could not ignore the cries, the flames twisting body and voice alike into a vision of agony meant never to be forgotten. Burial was another fate, one that carried a special horror. A pit was dug, or a drift of snow hollowed, and the woman was placed within, sealed under earth or ice while her kin stood above. It was not a warrior's death, not even a criminal's, the death of an outcast, a soul cut off from remembrance. Without fire or cairn, she was denied the passage that guided souls to their proper halls. Her spirit, it was said, would wander, restless and bitter, trapped in silence beneath the ground. These punishments carried more than the sting of law, they carried the mark of dishonor. A man might die by the axe and still win respect if he met death with courage, but a woman condemned to drowning, burning, or burial was remembered only for her crime. In her death, the community reinforced its order, declaring that even the keepers of hearth and kin were bound by fate and law. For in the north, justice spared no one, and when a woman defied it, her end was made a spectacle of both fear and finality. The sagas of the north are heavy with blood, for they remembered not only the valour of heroes, but also the terror of their ends. Among these grim tales are the famous executions that still echo through time, deaths spoken of with awe and dread, each one carrying the weight of vengeance, law, and the will of the gods. They were not ordinary punishments, but moments so fierce that they became legend, binding memory and terror together. Foremost among them is the fate of King Ella of Northumbria, whose name is forever tied to the Blood Eagle. When Ragnar Lothbrok, that iron-hearted raider, was seized and cast into a pit of serpents, he met death, mocking his captors, singing of the feast he would share with Odin. His sons, furious at such dishonor, swore vengeance so complete that Eyjar's death would never be forgotten. Taken captive, he was laid face down, and with knives and blades his ribs were carved from his spine, his lungs pulled wide until they flapped like wings. So the sagas tell us, and whether the tale holds truth or terror alone, it became the very symbol of vengeance that no king who slew a son of Odin's chosen could escape the god's retribution. Yet, Ella was not alone in meeting such a fate. The sagas are filled with men whose deaths were shaped as warnings. Egil Skallagrimsson, grim poet and warrior, was himself an executioner as much as a skald. His killings were often told with dark pride, for Egil struck down his enemies with no mercy, showing that even in saga, death was both law and song. Tales tell of how he avenged insults with the axe, and of how he slaughtered those who dared dishonor him, their ends recorded with the same care as verses of poetry. In Egil's world, execution was not merely punishment. It was a verse carved into flesh, binding fame to fear. The sagas also recall the fate of traitors and oath-breakers, who met ends as terrible as any on the battlefield. One tale speaks of Halfdan Longlegs, seized and subjected to the Blood Eagle, his ribs torn apart as a sacrifice to Odin for the betrayal he had sown. Others speak of men stoned to death by their own kin, or drowned in the fjords when their treachery was judged beyond forgiveness. Each death carried a meaning deeper than pain. It was a story told for generations, a reminder of what awaited those who strayed from law or honour. These executions endure in memory not because they were cruel alone, but because they spoke to the heart of the Viking world. Death was never only an end, it was a message, a warning, and often a gift to the gods. In the sagas, the killing of kings, the carving of eagles, and the drowning of traitors became more than punishments. They became the dark poetry of the north, verses etched in blood and remembered long after the bodies had turned to dust. Terror was a weapon as sharp as any sword, and the Vikings knew well how to wield it. Fear and control, these were the hidden blades behind the brutality of their executions. In a world where strength ruled and honour was currency, the sight of a man hanged from the gallows or a woman sinking beneath the black waters of a fjord was not only punishment, it was a lesson carved into the minds of all who watched. The Vikings lived in a society bound by fragile order, where feuds, blood debts, and rivalries burned hot. To keep that fire from consuming all, they used the fear of death, public and brutal, as their strongest law. When a man was beheaded before the thing, or a thrall stoned beneath the weight of his community's fury, the message was plain: break the law, and your body will be the warning. The violence was not random, it was deliberate, designed to be remembered. To see a blood eagle carved upon a traitor's back, to hear the screams of the condemned as flames devoured them, was to carry that memory home, a shadow that followed every hand that thought of straying. Brutality worked because it did not end with the victim. It lived on in the eyes of the living. Fear also bred unity. When a community gathered to watch stones rain down on an oathbreaker, the crowd became bound together in shared judgment. Each hand that cast a stone was cleansed of guilt, for the blame was not one man's but all. In this way, executions acted as both law and ritual, a grim reminder that justice did not rest in courts alone, but in the blood and will of the people. It was the theatre of power, where order was carved with steel and fire. But behind the spectacle was a deeper truth. The Vikings believed cruelty was strength. A chieftain who failed to punish his enemies with severity lost face, and with it, power. By turning executions into acts of terror, he displayed his might, not only to his kin, but to his rivals, his enemies, and the gods themselves. For a weak ruler let disorder fester, while a strong one showed that disobedience would be met with ruin. Thus, brutality became a form of rule, as much a shield as a spear. It is easy to think of such punishments as savage alone, but in the north, they were the glue that held a fierce warrior society together. The threat of the axe, the gallows, the sea, and the fire kept men in line when words could not. Fear, sharpened by ritual and spectacle, was the true lawgiver of the Viking world. And it worked, for while the condemned perished, the living were bound tighter to their rulers, their gods, and their fragile sense of order, knowing that one misstep could turn them from witness to victim. The legacy of Viking death rituals lingers like smoke over a battlefield, long after the cries of the dying have faded. Though the Norsemen are remembered for their raids, ships, and sagas, it is the brutality of their executions that carved the deepest mark upon European memory. To their enemies, the Vikings were not only invaders, but harbingers of dreadful ends, men who did not merely kill, but made death itself a spectacle to terrify all who stood against them. Their methods, whether truth or legend, spread like whispers in the dark, shaping the way the North was feared for centuries. The blood eagle, perhaps the most infamous of all, may have been performed only rarely, if at all, yet its legend grew larger than life. Medieval chroniclers retold it with horror and fascination, painting the Norse as worshippers of pain and cruelty. Whether it was the ribs of King Ella being pulled wide, or the lungs of a traitor exposed to the cold air, the image was enough to haunt the imagination of Christian Europe. Such tales were repeated, embroidered, and sharpened until the Vikings became not merely raiders, but living nightmares sent by pagan gods. Even the more common deaths, beheading, hanging, drowning, were remembered with a northern cruelty that set them apart. The gallows tree tied the Vikings to Odin's dark wisdom. Drowning recalled the cold mercy of the fjords. Fire turned longhouses into funeral pyres for the condemned. These were not simply punishments, but rituals that bound law, faith, and terror together. Long after the Viking Age had ended, Europe still spoke of them with unease, for their ways of death seemed to walk the line between justice and sacrifice. This legacy has not withered. To this day, the fascination with Viking executions holds a strange power over the imagination. They have become symbols of raw savagery, of a world where men's fates were decided not only by their deeds, but by the gods they served. In poetry, in saga, and later in the pages of history, the cruelty of the North became myth, remembered as both warning and wonder. Perhaps that is the true mark of their legacy, the way their executions transcended mere punishment and became stories in themselves. A beheading at the Thing was not just law, it was honour stripped away. A blood eagle was not just vengeance, it was destiny fulfilled. To the Vikings, death was never an end, but a passage, whether to shame, to Odin's hall, or to hell's cold embrace. And so their methods endure in memory more than 1,000 winters later. The Vikings may have vanished into time, their longships turned to rot and their swords to rust, yet their ways of death remain alive in the minds of men, grim echoes of a people who knew how to turn brutality into legend and terror into eternal remembrance.